Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
broadcast from later. Weak signals are simply things we notice in the world that may be strange, weird, or we don't fully understand, but we expect they may have a significant influence on the future's unfolding. We've each brought in a weak signal of change to share and unpack and dissect. We have not seen each other's in advance. I'm joined today by Udadir Macy Sue, Asia Clark, and Valdez Sillens, and we are in the spirit of experimentation talking today about weak signals around the theme of media and entertainment. It's our first themed episode, so we're trying that out. Asia, what's your weakest signal?
So my signal has to do with the memification of the death of Breonna Taylor. It's not necessarily new news, but the misconduct of police is nothing new. It's like part of the themes of 2020. And Breonna Taylor was a young African-American nurse who was killed in her home while she was sleeping by the police in Kentucky. So a lot of people have been calling for the arrest of the police officers who have killed her. However, because of Kentucky law, somehow, some way, it is very, very difficult to arrest them. What I think is really interesting about it, first thing is I was searching for signals. I saw this one signal that Oprah has bought 26 billboards, one billboard for every year of Breonna Taylor's life. They're up all over the state of Kentucky to basically keep Breonna Taylor's story in the minds of people in the community so that people don't lose steam for fighting for justice for her. And then the second thing is the memification of her death. You know, you'll see memes that say a random picture, and if you read really closely to what it says, they'll find in the fine print that says arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor, and it's all over the internet. And as much as it's important, obviously, to keep public awareness about, police misconduct and police brutality, especially against people of color, there's something a little bit off about the way in which it becomes a fad. It's almost as if Black suffering and Black pain is just a part of our culture in a very disturbing way. And so there have been a lot of people who've been calling just don't be sharing these memes because it's almost like making this a cultural wave and humorizing it, or in some ways even taking the seriousness out of it, while other people are how else are we going to keep this fresh in people's minds and keep people fighting about this if not in the language of social media as it is. Yeah, that's my signal.
And do you have an idea of what you think it signals, what it means?
Oprah, not only did she buy 26 billboards, but she put Breonna Taylor on the front of her magazine. This is the first time somebody other than Oprah is on the front of O magazine. Right. So, well, at least what I hope would be the case is that more celebrities de-platform themselves to highlight social issues in a way that's really visible and really impactful. I hope that that's what that signals. And the second thing I hope it signals is that there's so much more critical discourse happening in social media today than there ever was. And I feel like maybe somebody would have never thought a problem about creating a meme or a text image about something that's social, but maybe you might have a second thought again about sharing it, in the same way that a couple of days ago, there was a police killing of Jacob Blake. And that video, again, has gone viral. And so there's a lot of people being don't share these videos. It's, you're literally re-traumatizing minority communities and Black communities by sharing these things, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way that sharing the memes are, although people need to know. So what exactly, I think critical discourse around the sharing of pain is something that I wonder if it signals, or at least I hope way more nuanced conversations in the general public about the way that we share Black pain.
So the signal for you is the fact that people are responding to these things and the conversation evolving around, at a more nuanced level, around the fact that this is happening in a way that maybe you didn't hear as much about it in previous similar incidents.
It's a perfect signal for the topic, media and entertainment, because it really points to the question of where does media end and entertainment begin. Also, people hiding these sort of verbal memes inside images reminds me of, what happened after Jeffrey Epstein, where people were kind of memifying that too, right? Epstein didn't kill himself or whatever. Yeah, which was like people hiding that in like, I don't know, all kinds of places and images, in like signposts on the road and like banners and things like that. And so I wonder if it's just like picking up on that sort of cultural fad that came out at that moment.
I feel like there's something here in what happens at a human level, our reverence for death. And I think it has a lot to do with the word meme and the sort of like infinite replication of the image or the idea. In each layer, in each iteration of it, some loss of connection occurs to the original incident, to the reality of what happened or what occurred or what was recorded. A few things that come to mind for me is one is just like the history of both lynchings and executions as spectacle, as forms of sort of public entertainment or media as a form. To me, the first sort of instance of death period in 2006-07 would have been the Saddam Hussein execution that someone snuck a phone into that went viral. And, you know, since then, there has been so many of these, and then specifically the sort of complicated and really troubling issue of there needing to be sort of proof of these horrible murders of police against Black people for people to actually be upset about it. And then there's this other piece that's where the humor comes from and why. And there's, I think like on one, those who are posting these memes are using it as a device, as a technique to raise awareness. That's I think the intended purpose, but you would never do that if you knew the person, if you knew the family, if you were close to, you know, to someone. It's basically like knock knock, who's there, arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor or whatever. It's like and in so many different sort of witty ways or whatever. And so it's not directly about the person, about the killing so much as it is about the lack of justice being served for like these cops not even being arrested, right? Is the point being made. So yeah, there's a bunch to unpack there. I guess my take on Signal is like, is there something here about media, you know, removing our connection to the sort of respect that we have for the dead as people that seems to be a sort of natural, universal human quality.
I'm also curious about just like the role of media or our reliance on media for the act of remembering, and then also in creating our memories, as well as like creating collective memories too.
Like framing what we remember.
Right. Exactly. So I think there's also that aspect on top of thinking about death, but in like, what are we remembering about that incident of death or of trauma? But as well, I think with social media as a channel, and I guess like with meme as a form of expression, it could also serve as like a social archive, like where it allows for different ways of participating in memory making. But at the same time, there's also kind of an increasing dependence on media for memory work, essentially. Are we losing the process of creating a memory individually, whereas we can just be like, okay, we can look it up.
All of the very public and televised murders of African-American people by police officers, like the way in which their families and we get to remember them is completely constrained by the moment of like by media. Well, none of us knew Breonna Taylor personally. And now this is how this memory has been formed for us and reproduced for us to remember through memes. But I feel like, I mean, Breonna Taylor's own is particularly interesting because like you were saying, Udit, there was kind of like an Epstein quality to it, and not in the same ways that I feel like I'd seen for other police killings. You know, so like Breonna Taylor gets remembered as a meme is a little bit different than the other murders that I feel like I've seen, at least from my own perspective.
It's interesting you brought up the Epstein thing because it is the structure of the like humor involved in it is pretty much exactly the same. I think it's like to embed this like secret punchline of like Epstein killed himself or didn't kill himself, which was whatever that was in the meme. The big obvious difference, right, is that one is the victim and the other is the perpetrator.
Right.
And like that seems to be maybe have been like the thing that's like lost as people start using this jocular device or whatever to raise awareness or to, you know, say something. The Epstein stuff also seems sort of less consequential, more conspiracy minded, less straightforward justice minded, right? And
even so, like Breonna Taylor's death is not straightforward justice. You know, they actually
no, it wasn't. It's got the call for it. It's
right? Yeah. You know,
it's the opposite of straightforward justice. I mean, the purpose of the meme is to get that justice.
Yeah. Maybe another signal that it's pointing to is just like how convoluted into like why it would be difficult for like there to be an arrest of police officers that stormed into a house in the middle of the night, like and killed somebody. Like Kentucky law is structured in such a way that they just cannot arrest these people. Like one of them has been fired, and I think the other two are on leave, but like none of them have been, you know, arrested or anything like that. So I hope people become more interested in like how messy these laws are messy, you know? So hopefully that's the change that comes about.
Going back to your original tension that you highlighted between the sort of humanization and the sort of memification that happens on the internet, like the other death, right? Regis, what's her name? Regis Korchinski Packet.
Yeah.
Like the Twitter hashtag that went along with that when people talk about it is hashtag say her name, which is an attempt to humanize her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is so that she doesn't kind of become just, you know, this like tool for like political arguments.
Yeah, there's many other sort of slogans and memes that don't involve humor. And I mean, that's the other thing, is that the statement itself was not humor to begin with. It was just the way that it ended up being. The joke is we are not letting anyone forget about this. It is going to be everywhere you look. Like that is kind of like the idea behind this like recurring meme, I think. Movement of it.
And being sure people are paying attention to it. Like you could be just scrolling in your favorite meme account and then be like, oh, real life.
I mean, I think also humor can be an access point, right? Like it can be dark humor, it can be serious humor, but you're using that punchline to mobilize. I guess like hit it home, like hit the remembering home.
Yeah, I think it's a question of lines. And again, I think when you are distant from something, from the person, the people involved, the family involved, you probably will be more likely to feel comfortable talking about it in these ways. It's just like, you wouldn't make one of those jokes if you knew that her family was in the room or something like that. It's just like, I think almost everybody would, any sort of decent person would know that difference. And then online, people don't seem to. Verzuz, what do you think? Signal, noise, what's the signal of?
I don't know if I would call it a signal. I had an additional interpretation. I was just thinking about like the way the different like efforts at trolling often and memes can also be like reflections on the medium in which they're transmitted. And so like the fact that these kind of very serious issues are transmitted along the same channels in which we get like advertisements for like margarine, and in which we like communicate with friends at like an intimate level or at or acquaintances we don't even know. Like all of these things are condensed into this one channel, and it's kind of this absurd communicational structure. And so the meme is almost, just because I was looking at a few of them, because I'm like, what does it mean it's a meme? Like, what does it look like? And the ones I saw were all like mashed up with like corporate things, you know, like Disney movies with like secret clues about like where to arrest the cops or whatever. And they're kind of almost like a reflection on the medium itself. That's just an interpretation of like what the meme is doing. I'll just remain agnostic on whether it's a signal or not.
Udit, signal or noise?
I think it's a signal, and I also actually kind of agree with Aldis's point of this like general context collapse where all this sort of information that we get is crammed through the same channels. And particularly with media and politics, where we see politics becoming increasingly more influenced by media and media becoming increasingly influenced by politics. And, you can say the same thing about protests as well now. That's kind of what it sort of signals for me.
So like a convergence.
Yeah.
Macy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those takes. At the same time, it's like a call to be mindful of like the dangers of that as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that there's something here as a signal around mindfulness, just etiquette, decency, and sort of like bringing online some of the things that seem more obvious offline, and just people being more aware. It's the nuance piece that Asia articulated essentially. Udit, what's your weakest signal?
Yeah, my weakest signal is a video game called EndeavorRx. It's been in the news recently because it's the first video game to receive FDA approval, and so it can be prescribed as a therapy. I think it's the only game that I'm aware of that can be prescribed as a therapy. And it's prescription only for ADHD, specifically for pediatric patients. And it was launched just 2 months ago, got FDA approval in June. They've released it seems like there's solid evidence for the efficacy for the video game as well. They have a bunch of peer-reviewed papers, some in like pretty prestigious peer-reviewed journals, including The Lancet, which is, like supposedly a very well-respected medical journal. They did randomized control trials with a whole bunch of children to prove that it actually does work. I tried to understand what the gameplay was, but it's kind of hard to get a sense of it because it is prescription only. But as far as I understand it, it's sort of like an obstacle course that the player navigates, and you get rewards as you pick up, little trinkets or whatever that you might do in a game like Mario or whatever. The other thing that's interesting about it is that there isn't any winning. You don't actually win the game. The algorithm kind of just adapts to your progress, and it basically adapts the gameplay so that your attention level or focus as a player is maintained at the level that was prescribed by the doctor. And then
so it's
over
customizable.
Time, it's customizable, but also adaptive. So it's customized by the doctor to the prescribed levels, but it adapts so that it's basically changing in real time. So that you're actually making progress at like a certain level always. And then it adds like different sort of multitasking complexities so that you can increase the amount of attention you have towards the games. Yeah, so why do I think it's interesting? I think there's like something about the sort of mechanics and patterns that have been used in social media to play on people's psychological tendencies to make them feel addicted to games and kind of exploit them for profit. And this is, I think, an interesting example of somebody doing the opposite, which is at least they're claiming that it's actually to the benefit, like using those sort of psychological tendencies to improve outcomes for the user, right? So I think that's like the interesting thing for me here.
Who developed the game?
It's a game, I think it's a game development company in conjunction with a bunch of researchers.
No pharma companies involved?
As far as I understand, no.
I'm interested in why you need a prescription to be able to try it. Like, what are they trying to hide?
Or do you really need a prescription, or is it like the doctor can prescribe it, but like you can also just
no, it's prescription only. Like it's a therapy is the way they're talking about it online.
Okay. So it's like treatment in the form of a video game.
In the form of a video game, that's right.
Do you need a prescription for a therapist? You could just go and get a therapist.
Not a therapist, but like
a psychiatrist would give you a prescription for something.
I mean, I can imagine one of the reasons why they're keeping it prescription only is because I think they're trying to do more testing and like understanding the efficacy of it. All this exists for money. But I think like my non-cynical take is that it's actually just controlling who has access so that they can do more sort of testing with people, like, because they can sort of benchmark like where they were at a certain scale and then how they've changed over time. And the only way to do that is to know exactly who's coming in.
Does it mention any risks?
Yeah, I was looking at the study.
Side effects?
So 9.3% of the subjects experienced side effects, including frustration, headaches, dizziness, emotional reaction, nausea, and aggression.
All the usual video game stuff.
All the usual video game stuff. So I'm not sure if it's like specific to this particular treatment or is it just a video game artifact.
In the spectrum of what can be called RX, which just means prescription only, as far as I know, what is there that is non-pill? I like imagine like electrotherapy treatments and things like that, like would be in part of that, or like what kinds of treatments fall into that? You said this was the first video game, but just like we know, pills are the
in psychiatric treatment, there's a whole bunch of things that are not in pill form, right? There's like there's like neurofeedback stuff too now, which is like you watch something and then it kind of gives you feedback on like your brain waves and things like that. Basically imagine a Muse, but like the clinical version of Muse, the Muse brainwave headband. That would be neurofeedback, right? And it monitors your kind of beta waves or whatever that you have in your brain.
But does it like change your brain structure, or is it just monitoring?
I think the idea is that over time it kind of rewires your brain.
Asia, what do you think?
Sign me up.
Sign you up? Should we sign you up for Signal?
And this
I think it's so interesting.
It's specifically for ADHD, right?
This one is specifically for ADHD, but neurofeedback in general has many different applications: depression, PTSD, anxiety.
I do think it's a signal. I've like legit never heard anything like that before, and I'm going to do some more research on it just to learn more about it myself. So
about this signaling noise.
I mean, there was all that stuff on like people trying to use video games for like Alzheimer's and stuff a few years ago, and there's been other ones for like PTSD using like exposure therapy in like war situations and things like that. So the use of video games to try to achieve non-entertainment outcomes has like a long history, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And even for physical therapy, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like motion, like with the Kinect and everything. There were people trying to build like I forget what the term is, but yeah, for like basically building up your physical strength.
Valdis, was it you that was saying that you think that it's prescription only because they're trying to make money from it? Like why? I think that's the thing about it that's really like for me.
There's a bit of like a signal of like regulatory industry getting into video games, which is kind of interesting as a signal. Like what other ways could that be divvied up? The other thought I had when you said it was prescription only was like the only way I would believe like nonsense like this is if it like rewired people's brains who didn't have ADHD like in dangerous ways or something like that.
Right.
You know, if it like truly had some kind of weird effect, like it didn't interact with people in the same ways, like it produced different outcomes based on body type or whatever your brain.
Yeah.
Still sign me up.
But yeah, I mean, I find it interesting that it needed like FDA approval in that it's like treated almost as something that you.
Yeah.
There's something that makes me wonder if this is like gimmicky about that FDA approval piece and like why that needs to happen.
Yeah, and like what are they approving necessarily, or is it like are there more risks than we know, or?
Yo, were those side effects like the actual like indications of ADHD?
Well, some of them are frustration, emotional reaction, aggression. Yes, are often
and isn't that also like
with ADHD.
Isn't that also all like just being kind of side effects of like being on the computer too much, or like being on social media too much? Our everyday things that are happening right now to us.
There's a really funny like capitalist loop going on, I think. With this. Like, you know what you need to cure your ADHD? More video games. Like, it's like kind of like these like, I don't know, like any treatment that kind of asks you to do like more of the same thing. Here's a chair to fix your back because like what you need is like more time like being not active than like you know.
Right.
Like, that's like
the video for the the game itself is quite funny. It does not look like anything like a kid would ever play. Like it looks very like the product of protected industry. Yeah, of a research team. Yeah, and of somebody who just knows that they can like deliver a subpar product to like again protected industry.
Like
It's, you know, it's like hard enough to take like a vitamin, but get them to play this like game that they like can't stand when there's like how many thousands of like other games that have been like honed through competition to be like utterly addictive, way more engaging.
I'm curious to know like what it tells us about ADHD as a condition. Like, is there something that's just learned by the fact that this, assuming it does work, does that reveal anything about the inadequacy of past treatments or what was believed or known about ADHD? Macy, signal and noise?
I mean, I think it's a signal of all the kind of different things that we just talked about. But yeah, again, I think it's like something to watch for, like the exploitation of, and you know, the implications of what happens to the patient, so to say.
I feel quite like I need to know more before I can determine there's a lot that sounds like noisy, but I feel like just at its most essential level, like of what would have brought in, like when I hear first video game to be to have
regulated
by the FDA, regulated or something then other than explicit content. This is that's a signal. I'll go next. I brought in a signal today, and this is I would say a stronger signal, but maybe the what it signals will be weaker. My signal is in the media and entertainment world, Verzuz, Verzuz, and the Verzuz effect. So this is something that's been happening in the music industry that came up during the COVID lockdown. Basically a competition between two artists that have been selected. It happened initially on Instagram Live and was created, I believe, by Swizz Beatz and Timbaland, two huge hip hop producers. And they would bring together two like really like iconic artists that are comparable in terms of like their popularity, their genre, and so on. And they would go song for song back and forth with 20 songs of their career. So it allows sort of someone who may have way more hits to compete against someone who has, you know, at least 20. So basically like they're competing by sort of choosing songs that will be more popular, and people are voting in different like venues and coming up with winners. And I think there's judges or something, but it's sort of, and the who wins is sort of murky to me actually, but because like it's like almost like depending on what podcast you listen to or radio show you listen to after, like there'll be a consensus around who won. So it is sort of this like friendly competition idea. I think there is an official winner, but the spirit of it is very friendly. And it was something that basically this format had been tried by Swizz Beatz multiple times on the radio for a while, but it really took off during the period of COVID-19 situation where everything was shut down because people are at home, and it was like a very kind of convivial, bringing the culture together in good spirit, and something that I think prior, a lot of the artists might think they have something to lose, like they're a big artist. If they go in and they like are and lose to this other artist, it makes them look bad or something like that. But I think at that time, it being just all for the love and like to bring joy to people and to create entertainment, this kind of friendly competition was something that was able to go over. What's been kind of like amazing to see, and I would say this is like a business of entertainment kind of signal, was the amount of success that it had. Like within months of doing this very like grassroots kind of thing, it was like on Instagram Live with no deal with Instagram or anything like that. It was just sort of like, let's start broadcasting and see who tunes in. They made a deal with Apple Music. This is a multi-million-dollar deal. So it started being broadcast on Apple Music, but still on Instagram, still with no deal with Facebook or anything like that, just using the platform. And a big like Ciroc/Diageo endorsement as well. And the effect that it's had on the career of these mostly, I think every artist has been someone of kind of like the previous generation of Black music, like not the like current sort of young pop stars, but like all of those artists of the like first decade of the 2000s and the late 90s. And basically like for streams, it was like this huge bump for everybody involved. So, you know, artists like a DMX say that, you know, has classic songs, but not super big on the radio right now, had like, you know, highest streams of, you know, in years. So you had like artists with the highest single day streaming. I think the Babyface and Teddy Riley tracks, their streaming went up by 115% the next day. So like there's a lot of money being made and new fans being gained by the artists involved. And the one statistic that was listed in this Billboard article that was quite amazing was that Babyface went from 300,000 to 1 million IG followers overnight, which is like pretty wild in terms of like that level of popularity for someone who's kind of had his heyday in like in the 90s for sure. And so I think the signals here are a couple of things. Like there's the competitive element, which is something that, you know, goes back to like sound clashes and like reggae and dancehall and has roots in the West Indies and then in hip hop in New York and DJ battles and things like that. But this is sort of a different take on that sort of competition of going like song for song or verse for verse with someone in sort of competitive art. So there's that side. And then there's this kind of, I would call like artist empowerment side of it. I think that's like, this is just done in this very grassroots way. The aesthetic is very low production value. When Apple got involved, the sound got better, but the visual is the same. It's like a couple people like hanging out in a studio or whatever, or it's done, you know, over like a Zoom type of connection remotely. But yeah, the fact that it was able to take off at this time, these are the kind of the signals there. So, and I think it's interesting that at the same time, there's these other things happening in sports. Like I think Mike Tyson right now is touring, doing a like exhibition match against, is it Roy Jones Jr.? Yeah, so like they're both, you know, not obviously current boxing competitors, but are going off and doing this thing. And so there's this kind of seems to be this room for celebrities to kind of create their own competition, and I think competition just builds a sort of interest from audiences. So
does the audience interact with each other somehow?
Yeah, and it's actually like that's one of the exciting things is that like you're reading the thing and it's like Snoop Dogg and like everyone's just commenting, like, and so there's like quite a who's who of people watching. And so that happens on Instagram Live.
First of all, Verzuz battles have been, especially when the quarantine was really like lockdowny. Mm-hmm. The quarantine battles that happened during that time like gave a lot of people hope, like, and made a lot of people feel really good. Especially after the Jill Scott and Erykah Badu one. Like, I was on a group call with my friends after that. We were all like, literally, we could all exhale after having been just overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. So there's also like, at least the Babyface one and the Jill Scott Erykah Badu one, like those ones were particularly like soul nourishing from my perspective.
Yeah.
And then the one with Bounty Killer and Beanie Man, that one was hilarious. I really encourage everybody to go and watch. It was really funny. But something that happened during that one that was like really troubling was that during the Verzuz battle, police came to the place that they were doing the live stream and tried to disrupt the live stream on Instagram Live, literally police harassment on an Instagram Live of like two prominent Black artists, you know? So I think you could probably find that in some articles, because like everybody on the Instagram, because I could comment, anybody could comment. Everybody was like, what the fuck are the police doing here in our happy moment, disrupting, you know what I mean? But then they ended up leaving. So there's that. Maybe you're right, it might be a weak signal. And I think maybe that's where I'll stand, in that it is a weak signal. But I love that Babyface got a hold, you know, Babyface is such a don. He deserves his flowers, you know? Yeah. So I'm happy that like artists like that are like really getting recognition through this.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of like opportunity for intergenerational sort of like music sharing and stuff like that. I think that there's a lot of that happening. The streaming bumps are an indicator of that. What do you think, Macy? Is that signal or noise, or do you have an interpretation?
It's almost like an update of like kind of the culture within artist communities, for like there is like this culture of generosity between artists to support growth. And I see it almost kind of like a modern take on artist mentorship and like giving that opportunity for exposure, but as well, like it's flowing both ways.
Yeah, the like vibe of love between the artists, and almost all of them that I've seen, is very strong and not necessarily what you would expect when you're talking about something that is competitive, that is sport in a sense.
But I think also like with the competitive element, I think it's like it pushes creativity. It's like being under pressure, having, you know, that challenge. It's almost like they're working together to like create a show that's even better than what could be a solo show.
It's also been a great like boon for armchair musicology, I guess. Like I've personally been involved in so many debates about these artists and what's different and similar about them, that are sort of like inconsequential but like fun, and that these just like revive certain types of conversations or create certain types of conversations that I think a lot of people are having.
And I think as well as just like having Instagram Live as a channel, it's like allowing access to these kinds of conversations where like, you know, if you're restricted by being at an in-person concert, or you can't go, or like you can't pay for a ticket or something like that.
Yeah.
But now you can be there even without leaving your house, and you can participate in the conversation. You can be like joining the conversation with Snoop Dogg or whoever.
Yeah, Udit, I'm kind of curious what you think about like Instagram Live being like the town square or something in this case, which seems to be like how some of the media has like portrayed it, like even after like part of the reason they chose to make a deal with Apple Music apparently was because they were allowed to continue to use Instagram Live, which like it's almost odd. It's like that's our home base kind of thing, even though it's a Facebook product, obviously, which is like an interesting connotation that people have, you know.
I just want to start with a different point though, which is what I was thinking about when you were talking about this, which is the format where you have two people streaming at the same time is, I think, just really fascinating. Like,
and 5 people, like right now.
5 people is even more fascinating. And I think we've seen it many times in the last few years, right? Like TikTok was one of the first ones to do it at a mass scale, where they have like a built-in duet. So you can like, you know, go live with another person simultaneously and kind of go back and forth with somebody. And then, you know, within live streaming right now, there's like a big thing with co-streaming, where you're like streaming concurrently with somebody else. That's going as well. And I think, you know, this has to do with a lot of the things that Macy was saying earlier, which is that it's actually like kind of lowers the barrier for like ideation and just like soundboarding with somebody else, so you can like quickly create new kinds of content. And it sort of creates this, you know, content flywheel, because like you're just building off of somebody's like creativity and can create new kinds of like unseen, random, almost unknown, like new kinds of content, right? The town square question, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like I'm not an Instagram user, so like the fact that Instagram has become this town square, at least in the Western world, it's not surprising considering like the number of users it has, but also I wonder how long it's going to last personally.
This, you know, I said the term like artist empowerment, and there's this film that came out about a year and a half ago called The High Flying Bird, which was on Netflix and shot with iPhones, and it was about an NBA lockout, like a strike, essentially, where or a strike by the owners over fees to pay the players, and a disagreement around the salaries that players would be getting. And so the season hadn't started, but the sort of leverage that the players used in the context of this movie was like Instagramming one-on-one games among themselves as a way to sort of get an audience, get sponsors on board. And like in the context of this, just even the threat of throwing like 3-on-3 games and doing these different things, it ended up creating a consensus in this disagreement and getting the season started properly or whatever. But and sort of leaves it as a what if the players had just said like, fuck the NBA altogether, we're like gonna just do our own thing without you because we can on social media. And I think that's sort of an interesting piece of like what's happening here. This like it's a demonstration of like who the talent is and over the sort of like the suits essentially in the industry. And it's sort of like we can play together, but like be clear, we have all the leverage in the situation.
But they're still suits. It's just that the suits are changing. Now the suits are transitioning from being the record label to being like the social media platform CEOs, right? Like they're the one who making the deals about.
Well, that's the interesting thing with the Instagram one in particular. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
it's like
Apple
right, and Suck who are making those deals.
Yeah. There's still the suits, but there is these moments I think where the talent is,
has a moment of leverage.
Yeah. And this would be one of those. Yeah, so I don't know, but I find that the new kinds of content, that's the exciting part to me, is like thinking of different ways that like something that is supposed to be like songs, concerts or whatever, or 5-on-5 basketball games in stadiums can become something else, like, and you can create it in very different ways now, and that this media can be done, and that you can, have that. So the term player empowerment has been something that's you've been hearing around professional sports for a long time now, several years now. Valdez, what do you think? Signal and noise.
But what does empowerment mean in the context of like you used to be doing concerts where you got paid and now you're doing them to like boost your followers or whatever, and you get paid and like how many people follow you afterwards? I mean, I'm sure now with Apple Music maybe they're getting paid. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that it was a huge deal with Apple Music.
Right.
It was like there was like bids from Spotify, from Apple Music, from YouTube, from everybody.
It's just a bigger question in music of how do you monetize content.
Maybe it's just that.
Of social media and streaming and all that stuff. I think what's interesting to me is like that it takes place inside of like people's homes or studios. And then I just thought of it when you said like the vibe of people is very loving. And I was kind of like, well, why would that be? And obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in COVID period, but maybe part of it's just like when you're at home, it's like home vibe, and this domestication of seeing people's like interiors and also how the interior like shapes their vibe at that moment, shapes the kind of performance you're going to have, just like it's shaping
from later too.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say.
With interior design of everybody, it's Macy's Ivy plant.
Yeah. The convo we have is very different from like the neon lit stage we had on day one.
Right, that's right. Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking of these like 90s hindsight some vibes of like MTV Unplugged, and like the Much Music version was like, intimate and interactive at that time. But it's like got this kind of a more intimate feel. And in fact, those by comparison are still like highly produced television, where these are like not at the same level. Although the quality of the audio has gone up significantly over like sort of Verzuz by Verzuz.
Do you think the vibe is going to change post-COVID? Like, do you think when people will leave their homes and start doing this in studios, possibly?
It's a good question. I mean, this could be a concert as well, although you can't have, 500,000 people quite so easily at concert.
Right.
Do you think like concerts like at post-COVID will, like there will always be these two options, like you can go in person as well as like there's a ticket for a streamed version or something like that?
Erykah Badu has a concert series on her Instagram that you had to buy a ticket to, and it had pretty interesting like a production value, but like everybody was in these like bubbles. So all her performers, like all like her guitarist and her drummer were all in these different pods, and they weren't interacting. It was really weird, but obviously excellent.
If I recall too, there was a Drake and Lil Wayne tour that was like Street Fighter video game themed, and they went one song for song, and there was some way for the audience to like vote, and their points and power levels would go up and things like that based on that. So it could be that using competition so kind of it build hype around performance could become a thing. Signal or noise for anyone who hasn't spoken on that yet?
Strong signal is what I would say.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Macy, did you say?
Yeah, I thought it was, I didn't think it was noise, but I think it's just like the level like of revealing our current milieu and how we are, like artists are helping each other or monetizing on their work.
Verzuz, what's your weakest signal?
I chose this platform called Parler. I think it's called Parler. I don't know how to pronounce it because, you know, whenever you have a French word in America, it's like never entirely clear what it's going to sound like. You know, the way like La Croix is LaCroix.
Yeah.
Parler could also be Parler or something.
Yeah.
But I'm going to frame it in a different way than people would usually talk about it. So Parler is like one of these alt-right type like exit platforms for maintaining free speech that popped up when they started banning people recently from Twitter and I think even Facebook and stuff like that. Or if not, well, no, people were explicitly banned, but others were also like sanctioned in different ways. And the thing is, like these kind of exit efforts have been going on like for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, like since the start of these centralized platforms, and they all promise the same things, like decentralized mechanisms, enabling people to own their own data, free speech, blah, blah, blah. And yet like none of them seem to work or have worked. That's one side of it, like why it doesn't work. The other side of it is like what happened to the alt-right, and like is this a signal of just because like I don't care like one bit, like, and I just don't think anybody in the way that people were talking about it 2-3 years ago, like what happened to it and where is it now? Because this thing was big inside of that world, but I barely heard about it. And like honestly, when I did hear about it, I was like, couldn't really care less about it. There's two sides to my signal. There's the question of like, are any of these social media exit like little micro things viable on the basis of like a political commitment? What happened to the alt-right?
Can you give a bit of a history of like what you call alt-right exit platforms, like where if over the past...
Mastodon, it's not fully alt-right. Mastodon has like people like I think even Snowden was on it.
I have a Mastodon account.
Uda has a Mastodon account.
Well, Mastodon is the Fediverse, right? So like there are like
Yeah.
you can kind of host your own server and like you can decide who's on it and who's not.
I read about Parler, or Parlay, a couple of weeks ago, and I remember reading an article talking about people left Twitter and other like more popular social media platforms because they were being censored. But then Parler started censoring people on the app that were too liberal or something like that. So it's like it's almost like an echo chamber. Like it's intended to be an echo chamber. Or maybe like I'm being a little bit too like generalizing, but if the platform is doing the same thing for which it's created, like why it was needed to be created, because you know people were feeling like they were not able to like share their speech freely, but they're banning users.
Yeah.
Kind of
Classic free speech stuff.
yeah.
Are there any like restrictions to like how you can be on that platform? Like,
Well, apparently it is, but I feel like maybe the only restriction is how much alt-right stuff you could take, you know?
Rob, go back to your original question about like what is the history of these alt-right social networks. So, I mean, I think there were a bunch of them like back in the day, like the old ones, or like, you know, the 4chans and 8chans, which were...
What happened to 4chan that they needed to
still
be
there. You can still use it. And the idea there wasn't that they were explicitly alt-right or anything. They were just like, but they had zero moderation, so you could just go and post whatever the fuck you wanted to. But then more recently, when there were a lot of these moderation conversations, content moderation, and you know what people have called content policing as well, conversations on the mainstream platforms, including ones like Facebook, Reddit, whatever, there have been a host of new ones in the last 5 years, including the one that I'm most familiar with is Vote. And that was started when like a bunch of subreddits a few years ago were banned on Reddit. People were concerned that Reddit was kind of curtailing people's free speech. So that Vote was like a position as an explicitly free speech, welcoming alt-right platform and an alternative to Reddit. And Valdez, going back to your original question about where is the alt-right, it almost feels like to me there's no new clear net social media platform that's even viable anymore. I think everything is kind of happening in sort of this subterranean social network environment that's not going to bubble up to the clear net. It's all within these like cozy communities, whatever you want to call them, on like within group chats, within like, you know, self-hosted servers, including possibly the Fediverse as well, like these Mastodon type of networks that people are hosting themselves. So I think that's why you don't see like a big name like alt-right TM like social network out there, because I don't think it's like viable anymore.
So the alt-right is hiding is your answer to all this question.
Well, I think everybody's hiding. I don't know if like
Everybody's hiding.
I think everybody's kind of hiding. But I think where is alt-right? I think that's a good question. I think that alt-right isn't as relevant anymore. I think we talked about this earlier too, about this. I'm not sure if I have like a fully formed take on this, but it feels like the term alt-right is becoming more relevant just because like I don't think anyone even identifies with that position anymore.
Seems that like QAnon conspiracies are becoming like incredibly mainstream. We lead up to the U.S. election, I suppose. And where does that like, is that just a sign that some of the ideas that might have been really obscure sort of alt-right edges are now just kind of bubbling into the mainstream?
I think that's a different demographic. That's like suburban moms and stuff doing like that's how they make memes and whatever, you know?
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, that is the point that Rob was making too, is that it's not these like alt-right, you know, sort of this masculine troll environment. It's now like the mainstream. It's suburban moms that we would have.
Soccer moms.
Yeah, the alt-rights, the QAnon soccer moms.
That was kind of like what it was on 4chan and 8chan and stuff at one point. It was like Pepe memes and stuff.
Yeah, I mean the Pepe stuff is like, to me it's like not even alt-right anymore. It's just like the culture of the internet, you know, like it's across like the left, the right, everything.
I feel like you guys have such a more sophisticated view of like these like underbelly of the internet than I do.
I mean, it's cringy even to like mention the name alt-right, you know, and that happens in the space of like a year, I would say, or 2 years, you know.
Yeah.
And all the figures that used to be big in that world were discredited mostly, you know,
or arrested. They're either in a coma or arrested, or discredited.
The way that we're talking about it, like appearing and going underground, reminds me about the way in which the Ku Klux Klan was really prominent in like, I guess the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then by the, I guess, late 70s and 80s and 90s, it's like you like kind of went underground, or like to be part of the Ku Klux Klan became something that was so abhorrent that people were just, like people hid that identity and they could only do activities in the complete, you know, privacy of their own social circle. And I don't know, I feel like there's something, obviously, you know, there's something about the way in which Trump, God, he who must not be named, okay, dog whistles to this particular group, and then they show up in different places. Like, I could comfortably sit in this chair and be like, say with my whole 2 lips and my teeth and my tongue that like MAGA is definitely like people who could consider themselves MAGA, whether you're Black or like multicultural or white, like there's a certain upholding of capitalism and of white supremacy that you're complicit in and you're completely okay with. And that's literally like one little tick away from what the alt-right believes. So I feel like there are intersecting ideologies between groups that are in the right, and maybe, I don't know, I don't want to paint all people who are conservative as people who want to uphold that, because that's not what I think at all. But I do think that like, if you're wearing a MAGA hat, like you're really out here, you know, like not okay with what people who wear that hat do and stand for it sometimes. And the ideologies are kind of intermixed with other right-wing ideologies that are like, that kind of sounds suspect, but who do I know? You know?
Signal or noise.
I think what makes it an interesting signal to me is that a lot of these conversations are being had on social media platforms that are underground, but Parler was being like promoted by all these Republican senators and like all these famous people in like far right-wing sectors as a place where we can go and have our conversations too, and like, you know, like not be bothered by any of these like, you know, weirdo lefties. So it's like as a mainstream platform for that kind of conversation, as opposed to one that has to be had underground. But like, yeah, like I said, if they're gonna, you know, police what's on there, or if they're gonna like block users in the same way that Twitter does, then like they're really not standing for free speech. So.
Nacy, signal or noise?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it's another social media platform. It's just another platform.
So
and like, what's to stop another one of these from coming up for? It could be, if you think of it as like, you could have something like this to create a safe space for very specific communities that actually really need it. So I guess it's just I guess it's like noise, but it's interesting to think about how spaces can be created online and like what's the governance structure and or like how to not impose that kind of governance structure.
Odit, signal and noise.
Well, I think the thing that Valdis was trying to point at when he was framing it as a signal is that whether we can think about the failure of Parler as a way to kind of bookend the alt-right movement. And I think that's a really interesting question. I would say that if that's the signal, I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it as a weak signal, which I would agree with. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, it's like maybe just this kind of like infinite ability to be deplatformed, or there's always another platform for you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that, like Parler itself is. You're saying the fact that it's noise is kind of the signal in a way. I guess that sort of echoes what it was saying about it. But the signal to you is, oh, it's just another space for alt-right chat or whatever. And that will fail again, and that there will be another one again, and that's the sort of like noise part. Is that like you basically saying that some of these conversations are like less, like the signal is we could worry less about them, or what's the, like, how do you?
I'm not sure. I think it's open to question what caused the drastic like decline in a matter of like a year or two. Like a year or two ago, like the hottest books were coming out on the topic, and people were like endlessly discussing it. And obviously, like tons happened in the interim, but like Parler. Oh, sorry, no, Parler.
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 It is Parler. Yeah, which is funny of its own right. Was just the moment where I was like, where it hit me, where I was like, oh right, this thing is like really dead, like, and that happened so quickly. And it's not to say that the forces that caused it are dead, but that like some version of it that existed 4 years ago that gave it like all the energy that people claimed it had, like just vanished overnight. Yeah, I'm not sure why. I think that's what I'm saying. Like the interpretation is open.
Yeah, and I think the failure for Parler is it's both that I don't think social media platforms like that are that viable anymore, because there's you can have those sort of private conversations in these sort of group chats, like private spaces. And also, I don't think alt-right as a movement is that interesting, or is not the right way to understand that energy. That was the populist energy on the right anymore. There are other ways to understand it, which I haven't quite wrapped my head around, and I think that's going to be the big question coming up to this 2020 election too. And where does like all this conspiracy theory, Great Awakening, QAnon stuff fit in? How much of that were like disenfranchised, Rust Belt folks who might just go to the left now? I don't know.
For me, yeah, I would say mostly noise to me, but I like the signal of like the intensifying velocity of the pace of cringe, which is just like always ever increasing as like the universe expands. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
It's called Traumagotchi.
Traumagotchi.
Yeah. And it's a web project for what they call virtual spellcasting, collective healing, and general deep machine incantation. So
more video game medicine.
Yeah.
That's
so
great.
yeah, I was like, when Udit said it, I was like, I should go next. But yeah. You go on the site and you're like directed to create a virtual version of your trauma, which is called your Traumagotchi. And essentially they become these creatures that tend to a space that they call deep in the machine world trauma compost shrine. And so like your trauma lives in the space, and while the website is active, there's code in the shrine that casts virtual spells for healing. So they're like spells for healing in the CPU, GPU, and interweb astrosphere. I mean, it's all a virtual simulation, but it's interesting that they use that language, like computer system language. So the Traumagotchi can be fed, bathe, it can rest, and you can also program virtual self-care actions, but also I think you can also do self-harm actions as like coping mechanisms to recur every, 5 minutes, 60 seconds, however, so that whenever you log off, it'll keep self-caring or self-harming itself. And then as well, users you can like release words or set intentions in the shrine. So it's essentially like a concretized digital version of that shows like the physical labor of healing. I think it's also like an example of, I've been reading about this concept of data healing, which is a concept that came about from a guerrilla theorist and curator, Nima Gittir, in response to the term data trauma, which was coined by a media artist and programmer to describe effects of navigating digital infrastructures and like dangers of exploitation, capitalism, being categorized, being discarded of your own personhood in the digital world. And I just wanted to like read a segment of this kind of manifesto on data healing. So she says, data healing is not an abstract, it's a movement. It is everything moving. It is madness and magic on screen. It is an experiment in channeling source. It is so real that it can be fake. It is fundamentally existential. It is how to make sense of what we feel digitally to understand what it all means for our bodies. So yeah, I think it's just the Traumagotchi is like an interesting digital materialization of this movement that uses experimenting with code, experimenting with digital language to promote healing.
That's
like
profound.
It's cool. I should you can play on it and create your own Traumagotchi.
It's funny why, for some reason, it just feels like a really good idea and like a really effective version of this video game thing that, like, by comparison, Udit, your Signal, which was like the official RX one, just doesn't, like, I'm so much more skeptical of it.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. It sounds way more like useful, personally.
Yeah, and what a name. You really get it instantly.
Yeah, right away.
Yeah.
Powerful portmanteau. Yeah, I like this pedify your shit.
How would you frame the Signal?
I think there's like a signal of like power of like personification is really what I mean, but like a plan, like, or something like that, like building of like world building and making things that can feel quite abstract. Like, sure, the memories are somewhat real, but the effects of those memories on you in the case of trauma are quite abstract and strange and not well understood usually by the person who's going through them. And like, that's the whole, it's using story to get a handle on things that torment our souls.
Yeah, I think it's like using a way to internalize and externalize like dark subjects.
And playfully, like that's the other big thing here, right?
Yeah.
But like externalizing your trauma like that and like imagining it in an object or in another sort of living entity that's not a new thing. That's like, you know, that's like an effective technique for thousands of years, possibly. I'm just trying to think about like what is new here?
I think what is new, but is also old, now that I think about it, is digital witchcraft.
Yeah, there's also like digital doulas. That's like kind of a role that's sprung up and people identify themselves as that.
It kind of reminds me of like, remember when we used to get chain emails being like, you know, it's like, if you don't forward this, you're going to get bad luck for 7 years. I feel like there's some sort of thread that ties those two together.
It's the digi-witchy superstition.
Yeah, and I think like with the data healing concept, there's also this, she also talks about like alchemizing trauma that is enacted by the internet into new technologies, like new digital materializations. So yeah, bringing in like that witchcraft idea that you're talking about there, Asia, but like using code and using computer language to kind of subvert the traumas that those digital infrastructures are also causing harm at the same time.
Well, you know, words are spells, you know.
This Signal or noise?
I think in the playful use of language around trauma, yeah, I think so. Because it has like often been used in a way that leaves no exit, I think, for the people affected. And maybe, I won't like run the term, but I think the playful use of trauma is interesting. So I'm kind of curious from a cultural angle how that's shifting and the language around it. So yeah, I think it's a signal in that sense.
Asia?
Well, I love it as a signal, so I'm gonna just give it 2 thumbs up. But I was just thinking, I wonder what the data that's collected on this will tell us about our trauma and about ourselves, or about like segments of the population as a whole. I wonder to what extent people want to self-harm their Traumagotchi. Like, what does that say, you know, about us? So I'm interested to find out, maybe, you know, if this becomes really popular and a lot of people use it, what does the data that's collected in this app tell us?
And also like what the traumas that people are personifying are.
Put it.
The use of magical language and sort of witchy stuff in technology isn't, to me, that's like also not that new. I've been kind of following that for the last few years. I think that one thing that stood out for me when Macy was describing it was the the sort of little automated actions, like you can automate the self-harm and the self-care and whatever. I think that's really interesting. I think it's like, well, if you push that out even into the future, what does that look like? Can we have a fully like virtualized care machine that's like, you know, you like externalize your trauma or whatever, and then there's basically an AI that's like taking care of you, you know, in this virtual world in some way. That I think is like I don't know, like interesting to think about. I think it's a signal of something. Yeah,
there's something interesting, like it's a bit placebo-ish or something, but like that's fine, where especially when you're talking about things like this that are abstract. Why would you want anything other than placebo? Whatever works.
Exactly. And to me, like the data point that Asia was making right now is, although it's interesting, I think that's like not even the point of this, right? It's like you don't actually, do we want to know anything about like the quantified and sort of medicalized way of looking at trauma, or do we want to? Do you want something that's
know
more
whether people want to torture their trauma or nurture it or what, you know?
Yeah, but I think it's way more affective than like actually like whatever else it is. Yeah.
I wonder how, like, if they sold that data, how it would be used. That's I guess, or like how would they monetize it, and what would knowing about our traumas would be displaced? Like, what would they then sell to us? You know what I mean?
I find this to definitely be a signal, and particularly because I find there's something I can't quite articulate about why it just seems so right the way it was described, and why it seems like it would be so effective and work so well. To me, there's a tangibility, and that's what it is, or like a stickiness. There's something right about to me, it really feels like a way that you can have control over something that maybe controls you, and to take that back, and the idea that you can like lock it up, put it outside, like, you know, automate sort of like the care or like healing of it seems empowering, like it would be empowering to a person, and sort of like a great step in the sort of like naming your trauma so that you can deal with it and dealing with it thing. It's like a little bit of a simple, like playful system that I think that just instinctually I think could be really useful as someone like, you know, no expertise.
Yeah, it's a cool one. I like it a lot.
Broadcast from later.